The Geneva Conventions are a set of international treaties that establish the standards of international law for humanitarian treatment in war. They are the cornerstone of international humanitarian law, IHL, aiming to protect individuals who are not participating in hostilities, such as civilians, medical personnel, and aid workers, as well as those who are no longer taking part in combat, such as wounded soldiers and prisoners of war. The conventions were first adopted in Geneva, Switzerland, hence their name, and they have been supplemented by additional protocols that address modern forms of conflict. Historical background and development. The origins of the Geneva Conventions trace back to the mid-19th century, a period marked by significant developments in the laws of war. The initial impetus came from the experiences of Swiss businessman Henry Dunant, who witnessed the horrors of the Battle of Solferino in 1859 during the Second Italian War of Independence. Disturbed by the sight of thousands of wounded soldiers left without adequate medical care, Dunant organized local volunteers to assist them, regardless of their nationality. His experiences led him to propose the formation of voluntary relief societies and the establishment of an international agreement to protect the wounded and those who care for them in times of war. This proposal eventually led to the formation of the International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, and the adoption of the First Geneva Convention in 1864. The 1864 Convention, known as the Convention for the Amelioration of the Condition of the Wounded in Armies in the Field, was groundbreaking. It established the neutrality of medical personnel and facilities, ensuring that they could carry out the duties without interference. The convention also introduced the distinctive emblem of the Red Cross on a white background, which signified neutrality and protection. The four Geneva Conventions of 1949. While the 1864 Convention was a significant step forward, it was limited in scope and coverage. Over the years, it was revised and expanded to address new challenges arising from armed conflicts. The most significant developments came after World War II, a conflict that saw unprecedented levels of brutality, including widespread atrocities against civilians and prisoners of war. In response, the international community undertook a comprehensive review of the laws of war, resulting in the adoption of the four Geneva Conventions of 1949. The First Geneva Convention deals with the treatment of wounded and sick members of the armed forces in the field. It expands on the provisions of the 1864 Convention by including additional protections for medical personnel, facilities, and transports. It also extends the protection to wounded and sick combatants, ensuring they are treated humanely and receive the medical care they need. The Second Geneva Convention extends the protections of the First Convention to members of the armed forces at sea. It specifically addresses the treatment of shipwrecked sailors, whether from the Navy or other maritime forces, and ensures they receive the same protections as wounded soldiers on land. The Third Geneva Convention focuses on the treatment of prisoners of war, POWs. It outlines the rights of POWs and the obligations of the detaining power, including provisions for humane treatment, adequate food, shelter, and medical care. The convention also prohibits torture, coercion, and any form of discrimination against prisoners. The Fourth Geneva Convention provides protection for civilians in times of war. It is a response to the atrocities committed against civilian populations during World War II, including the Holocaust. The convention sets out the obligations of occupying powers toward the civilian population and prohibits acts such as deportation, hostage-taking, and collective punishment. Additional protocols of the Geneva Convention. The Geneva Conventions of 1949 have been supplemented by 3 additional protocols, which were adopted to address the changing nature of warfare and to provide greater protection for victims of armed conflicts. Additional Protocol 1 of 1977 relates to the protection of victims of international armed conflicts. It expands the protections of the Geneva Conventions to include wars of national liberation and introduces new rules concerning the conduct of hostilities, such as the prohibition of indiscriminate attacks and the obligation to distinguish between combatants and civilians. Additional Protocol 2 of 1977 relates to the protection of victims of non-international armed conflicts, such as civil wars. It provides minimum standards of humane treatment for all persons not taking part in hostilities, including those who have laid down their arms or order combat. The protocol also prohibits acts such as murder, torture, and cruel or degrading treatment. Additional Protocol 3 2005 introduces an additional emblem, the red crystal, alongside the Red Cross and Red Crescent, for use in situations where the existing emblems might not be perceived as neutral. The red crystal is intended to provide an alternative that can be used in conflicts where the other emblems might be seen as having religious or cultural connotations. Key principles and provisions. The Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols are built on several key principles that underpin international humanitarian law. One of the most fundamental principles of IHL is the distinction principle, which requires distinction between combatants and civilians. Combatants are legitimate targets during armed conflicts, while civilians and civilian objects must be protected from attack. This principle also requires that parties to a conflict distinguish between military objectives and civilian objects and refrain from targeting the latter. The proportionality principle prohibits attacks that would cause excessive harm to civilians or civilian property in relation to the anticipated military advantage. It requires that the military advantage gained from an attack be balanced against the potential harm to civilians, and that such harm be minimized. The military necessity principle permits only those measures that are required to achieve a legitimate military objective and that are not otherwise prohibited by IHL. It limits the use of force to what is necessary to achieve a specific military goal, while prohibiting actions that would cause unnecessary suffering. The humanity principle underlines the need to avoid unnecessary suffering and protect human dignity. It prohibits actions that cause superfluous injury or unnecessary suffering, such as the use of certain weapons or tactics that are designed to inflict maximum pain or destruction. The non-discrimination principle requires that all individuals be treated humanely and without discrimination based on race, nationality, religion, political opinion, or other similar criteria. This principle ensures that all persons affected by conflict are afforded the protections they are entitled to under IHL. Enforcement and challenges. The enforcement of the Geneva Conventions is primarily the responsibility of the states that are party to them. States are required to enact domestic legislation to implement the conventions and to prosecute individuals who commit grave breaches, such as war crimes. The conventions also establish the right of the ICRC to offer its services to the parties to a conflict, to visit prisoners of war, and to monitor the treatment of civilians. Despite these mechanisms, enforcing the Geneva Conventions remains a significant challenge. Violations of IHL, including breaches of the Geneva Conventions, are all too common in modern conflicts. Factors such as the rise of non-state actors, asymmetrical warfare, and the blurring of lines between combatants and civilians complicate the application and enforcement of the conventions. Moreover, the lack of a centralized enforcement body means that accountability often depends on the willingness of states and international bodies, such as the International Criminal Court, ICC, to take action. The Geneva Conventions in the modern world. The Geneva Conventions have been ratified by every country in the world, making them universally applicable. However, the nature of conflict has evolved significantly since the conventions were adopted. Modern warfare often involves non-state actors, such as terrorist groups and militias, who may not adhere to the rules of IHL. Additionally, new technologies, such as drones and cyber warfare, present challenges that the drafters of the conventions could not have anticipated. In response to these challenges, there have been calls to update and adapt the Geneva Conventions to better address the realities of contemporary conflicts. While the core principles of the conventions remain relevant, there is a growing recognition that new legal frameworks may be needed to address issues such as cyber warfare, autonomous weapons, and the protection of civilians in urban warfare. The Geneva Conventions represent one of the most significant achievements in the history of international law. They embody the international community's commitment to limiting the horrors of war and protecting those who are most vulnerable during armed conflicts. While the conventions have been instrumental in shaping the conduct of war and providing a legal framework for the protection of human rights during conflicts, they also face challenges in the modern world. As warfare continues to evolve, the principles of the Geneva Conventions must be upheld and adapted to ensure that the humanitarian ideals they represent continue to guide the actions of states and non-state actors alike.
Well, thank you so much for watching, and please don't forget to hit the like button.